Hi there, my name's Liv. In my continued exploration into knitting, this week I decided to make a video on how-to basics of all the things that you might need whenever you're starting off knitting. Knitting compared to crocheting seems to be a little bit easier because there are fewer different types of stitches that you can come across. So in this video, you'll learn how to do basic things like knitting, purling, knitting two things together or purling two things together, knitting front and back, casting on, casting off, and weaving in your edges. First thing I wanted to talk about before we get to anything is the idea of yarn weights. So yarn weights is basically the measurement that's used to distinguish the thickness of a yarn. So for this project, I'm going to be making a small sweater for the frog that I made a couple weeks ago. And I'm using these two yarns, which one is labeled DK weight, which means double knit weight. And then this other one is labeled just as yarn group B, because Drops has their own way of organizing yarn, but it was found in the DK section at the yarn store. The one big thing that's different between these two types of yarns is the white one is 2-ply or double ply yarn. So it's two pieces of yarn wound together, compared to the yellow yarn, which is 4-ply yarn, which is 4 pieces of yarn wound together. Because both of these yarns are different plies, which I wouldn't really recommend. If I had noticed, I would have bought 4-ply for the white color as well. The biggest difference that makes them look like they're different sizes is the fact that with smaller ply yarns, whenever they're stretched, they tend to shrink more, whereas more ply yarns tend to keep the same sort of width as they're stretching. So the first thing you have to do when starting any project is a slip knot, I believe is what they're called. That's what I call them. There's a lot of different ways to do this, but the way that I do it is I make this loop of yarn and sort of fold it over and then pull the extra piece through. I really like doing it this way because I can tighten the loop after I've knitted it, so basically turning into a knot instead of a loop. So for this project, we have to do what's called a rib cast on. So you start this the same way that you would start a regular cast on. So you basically have to knit the first stitch like this, and then instead of pulling the stitch onto the other needle, you actually pull it up and put it back onto the same needle. So if you were casting on regularly, you would just do this over and over for how many stitches that you have to have for the project. But for this one, since I'm doing rib cast on, I actually have to enter the needle between those two stitches and then sort of pull the stitch through and then hook it on. The rib cast on is a little more challenging than regular cast on because the thread ends up becoming a little bit tighter as you're working. So you have to be careful to make sure that you're not knitting everything a little too tight to the point where you won't be able to actually knit the stitches later on. Now that we have all of those stitches cast on, the first thing I'm going to show you how to do is how to do a basic knit. So your right needle goes into the first stitch, you wrap the yarn around the needle, and then sort of pull the needle down to hook that wrapped yarn, and then pull it off that needle. And then whenever we're doing purls, it's the same sort of thing, except the needle's going to go in through the front of the stitch. You wrap the yarn down and around, and then pull the stitch off. The important thing between the two is with knitting, the working yarn starts at the back, and then with purling, the working yarn starts at the front. For this pattern, if you're interested in learning how to make this tiny sweater, the link will be in the description below. It's made by this artist called Claire Garland. She makes a lot of knitted patterns online, including the frog one that I made. So this style of stitching here is called ribbed stitching. It's this type of stitching that kind of looks like those nicely manicured lawns that have like the lines of grass because they're cut in different directions. So you have some rows of purls and then rows of knits back and forth, and then whenever you flip the work over, it's going to be the opposite type of stitch on that side. So on one side you're going to see, for example, purl, knit, purl, and then on the other side it's going to be knit, purl, knit. Just because knitting and purling are like sisters of each other. The way that you can tell what type of row you're doing is if you have this little ball of yarn, depending on what side the yarn is on, that'll tell you what type of stitch it is. So if the ball is on the front, like these ones here, that is a purled stitch. And then for the ones that don't have the balls of yarn, the ball of yarn is on the opposite side facing away, that's a knitted stitch. So whenever you're changing colors, what I like to do is I like to take the new color and make a slip knot, and then put that knot onto the needle that I'm going to use to knit, and then knit with the knot. This is just what I like to do because I think it makes them fairly secure. After that, I take the two short ends of the yarn and I can just tie them together like you would in a regular sort of tying my shoes type of way, basically. And then later on, we'll be able to weave in all of these threads into the work so they're going to hide away and we won't see them anymore. So the first new type of stitch we're going to do is the knit front and back that's written KFB. So first thing you do is you knit your stitch, but then instead of pulling it off of the needle, you bring the right needle behind the left needle and then knit into the back of that same stitch. So we're basically doubling how many stitches there are. So instead of having 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches. So this is something that you can do to increase the length of your pattern to make it a little bit larger. So this is something that some people will do for things like sweaters where it has to expand around where the shoulders are. And this is what the back of the work looks like. So this is the wrong side and then this is the right side. It's nice and smooth. And then we can see all of these little white dots here. That is what it looks like whenever you do a knit front and back stitch. So that's how you could tell where the extra stitches were added whenever you're looking at the project. Make sure that everything is nice and spaced out properly. So we just continue on with the pattern. Again, if you want this pattern, just look at the description. So the next thing we're going to do is purl front and back. So it's the same thing as knit front and back. You purl regularly. Then the important thing here is to bring the working yarn between the two needles so it's behind. So if you were looking at it from the other side, the yarn is at the bottom. And then we're going to purl through the back. So this is the same thing as the knit front and back where it adds another stitch. So we have 2 stitches there instead of 1. But the difference is it's going to look like a purl on the nice pretty side. So it's important if you're doing rows back and forth of knitting and purling that you're using the right type of stitch for that row. Now this is the part of the pattern where we start to separate the front, the back, and the sleeves from each other with needles. So you do need multiple needles for this pattern. Here I've knitted across the front half part, and then I'm picking up a new needle to separate the sleeve from the rest of the work. So this is really important because whenever we're working on the sleeves, we're going to be working just on the sleeves. So that means we're going to knit across, turn the work around, and then continue on just the sleeves until they're done. So it's really important that you have multiple needles for this because it just makes it a lot easier so you can work on just the sleeve and not touch anything else. So this is what the sleeve looks like when it's separated from everything else. And I'm just going to continue following the pattern. So the next sort of stitch we're going to do is to decrease your number of stitches. This is called purl 2 together. So we are just doing a regular purl, but instead of purling 1 stitch, you just purl 2. Sometimes people will also have patterns that have purl 3 together. And then this one here is knit 2 together, which is the same thing. We're just going to do a regular knit, but instead you are knitting through 2 stitches. So this decreases your number of stitches by 1. So now that we're at the end of this sleeve, I'm going to show you how to do just a regular cast off. So for this one, I am knitting the first 2 stitches, and then the first stitch that I knitted, I'm going to take with my other needle and pull over the other stitch and pull it off the hook. And then I'm going to continue doing this. So you should never have more than 2 stitches on your right needle. You have to always pull off the second one, knit the next stitch, and so on and so forth until you make it to the end of the row of all the stitches. And then this last stitch, because there's no other stitch that we can cast off with, we have to cut the thread and then just pull the little tail of the thread through the stitch nice and flush. Important thing to remember with casting off is to not do it too tightly, or else the cuffs will be really, really small and they'll shrink a lot. There should be some shrinkage, but not so much that it's ridiculously tight. That's what the sleeve looks like. So we're going to continue the body part of the sweater here, and it's important to make sure that you're going in the right direction. It was nice because I switched color yarn here so I could see that that other front part was already done with the yellow yarn, so I can just start going through the center. And I'm going to do the same thing as before where I make it to the other sleeve, which I will separate onto another needle and then work on just the sleeve. In order to join the front half of the sweater to the back half of the sweater underneath where the sleeves are, so through the armpit, I just purl across all of the stitches until I get to the end of that needle, and then I take the left needle with all of the front stitches and just purl across that gap. So it's really important that we make sure that we're purling between these two seams as tightly as we can, just to make sure that the sleeves come together properly. This next type of stitch isn't in this pattern, but I still wanted to show it. First thing you have to do is insert the right needle into the left stitch as if you're going to knit it, but just pull that stitch onto your right hand needle. And then afterwards you knit the next stitch. And then this is really nice because the yarn is a different color. We're going to take that slipped stitch and pull it over the knitted stitch, similar to whenever you're casting off. So this is just another way that you can decrease the number of stitches that you have. So the bottom of the sweater uses something called a rib cast off. So the important thing to look at here is what type of stitch you're doing. If it's a knit or a purled stitch previously, you have to match the same thing. So this first one was a purled stitch, and then this one is a knitted stitch. So I'm going to imitate those and then pull the first purl stitch over the knitted stitch like you would do regularly when casting off. The rib cast off is a little bit different because the knitted pattern before it is all ribbing, where it's purl knit, has that sort of lawn design to it. So whenever you're doing the rib cast off, you're basically just maintaining that lawn design. So you want to make sure you're being very careful and paying attention to what type of stitch you need to be doing. So this is what the sweater looks like before we sew all of the edges together. Very cute. It looks like a little cardigan. So whenever you're weaving in your edges, what I like to do is go from the ugly side, the wrong side, and I find a thread like this orange one here that's nice and visible, and take a tapestry needle, which is these thicker needles, and weave it back and forth into those threads. And then I can just take the extra yarn, put it through the end of the needle, and then I'm able to just pull the needle forward, bringing the yarn with it and tucking that extra yarn into all of these stitches. It's a nice way to hide this extra yarn, and it makes it a little more secure than just cutting the thread really close to the knot. So the second last thing we have to do for this guy is sew the two parts of the sweater together. So we're doing what is called a mattress stitch seam. So you have the threads that sort of make these stacked ends, these little V designs. And you basically have to go between the two lines of the bottom end and the two lines of the top end, like this, and find the thread that is between those two chunks, I guess. Sort of hard to describe it. I think it's easier to just see it. But two ends stacked on top of each other. The top end is sort of hiding the top curl of the bottom end. You have to find that part of the thread and pull it through. So the last thing you have to do for this project is something called blocking. There's a couple different ways you can do this. The way that I do it is I take a soft surface like the top part of my ottoman that I have, and then I take these little sewing needles that I have, and basically you just take the sewing needles and press down all of the sides and pin them in place. And while I'm doing this, I'm doing a little bit of stretching, so I am pulling the yarn a little bit into the shape I want. And then you have to use very, very hot water in a spray bottle and spray down your work. So another way that people might do this is they might use an iron, or some people will spray it with water, pin it down, and then also iron it. It kind of depends. I just don't own an iron, so this is what I end up doing. This works well enough, but the only thing that kind of sucks is you have to wait for it to dry, because you really are supposed to saturate this thing. So it needs to sit here for like 16 hours for it to get nice and dry. But afterwards, you'll have this nice, smooth, blocked out sweater. The The last thing to do with this sweater is to just pull down the little neck, because it does have a little cuffed neck, and then you can see what it looks like on my little froggy. Here it is, very cute. So I hope that this video was helpful for anybody who's like me and learning how to knit for the first time ever. It's pretty fun whenever you get the hang of the basics, and almost any pattern you come across will have these basic stitches in them, so you'll probably be able to create most things that you see online. If you enjoyed, please consider dropping a like on this video, and also hit the subscribe button if you want to see more videos like this. See you later! Bye!